Today we're going to dive into a pattern that shows up everywhere, from ancient scriptures to our modern-day headlines. It's the pattern of power. We're going to explore how sources, separated by thousands of years, give us the exact same warning.
You know, our whole discussion today really boils down to one single, timeless question that societies have been wrestling with forever. What happens when the people and institutions with power lose their moral compass?
And I want to be super clear right up front. This isn't an attack on any particular group or belief system. Not at all. Think of this as a deep dive into the ideas, a look at how different sources, from ancient texts to secular history, have all tried to make sense of this universal challenge of power and corruption.
So here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with Scripture's symbolic warnings. Then we'll trace that same pattern through history. After that, we'll unpack the huge difference between ideology and faith. And finally, land on why truth is seen as the ultimate answer to it all.
Okay, Section 1, Power's Timeless Question. Let's start by digging into what really happens when authority is left completely unchecked.
So, Part 2, Scripture's symbolic warnings. Now, you might be wondering, why are we starting with ancient texts? Well, it's not because we're reading them as literal history. It's about understanding how they use this really intense symbolic language, what scholars call apocalyptic language, to critique power. Our job is to decode.
Let's just dive right into one of the most debated and, frankly, misunderstood passages out there. It's from the book of Revelation, and it says, "The blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan." Whoa. Okay, that language is really jarring, right? But to get what it's actually saying, we have to step back from a literal reading and look at the context, historically and literary.
So what's really going on here? Well, mainstream biblical scholarship is pretty clear on this. The book of Revelation isn't literal journalism. It's what's known as apocalyptic literature. It uses these wild symbolic images to make a really strong, pointed argument. And the target here, it's not an ethnic group. It's a fiery critique of any authority, any institution that claims a righteous name but acts corruptly. In other words, it's a takedown of hypocrisy. And this isn't a one-off thing either. We see this exact same pattern pop up elsewhere. Here in the book of Matthew, the same kind of critique is aimed right at the scribes and Pharisees, the religious establishment of the day. The charge is hypocrisy. He calls them whited sepulchres, tombs that look beautiful and clean on the outside but are full of death and decay inside. Once again, the bullseye is on behavior, not bloodline.
All right, Part 3, History's Repeating Pattern. Let's pivot now from scripture to secular history. Because you're about to see that this idea that power leads to corruption isn't just a theological concept. It is a predictable, observable pattern that plays out over and over again. Just look at the trail history leaves for us. The Roman Republic didn't fall to an outside enemy. It rotted from the inside as power became more and more centralized. The French Revolution? It started with these incredible ideals of liberty, but it spiraled into ideological terror. And of course, the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century all use these grand promises of a perfect future to justify absolute brutal control. The pattern is just undeniable. And the historian Lord Acton just nailed it with this quote. This isn't some radical new idea. It's a fundamental observation about how power and human institutions work. It's what happens, almost like a law of nature, when you remove all the checks and balances. And this is a really crucial point. Recognizing this pattern isn't about falling for some conspiracy theory. This is mainstream historical observation. For centuries, scholars of all stripes, religious and secular, have pointed out that concentrated, unchecked power follows this predictable slide towards decay. So that brings us to a really important distinction. How do these power structures actually maintain their grip? This is where we need to explore the difference between two forces that can sometimes look alike but are, at their core, worlds apart: faith and ideology.
This chart really gets to the heart of it. On one side, you have faith, which, in its truest form, is all about what's going on inside a person. It appeals to your conscience, it calls for humility, it encourages you to restrain yourself, it tries to persuade. But ideology? That's about external control. It's not about persuading, it's about enforcing conformity. It demands compliance, and if that doesn't work, it coerces.
Scripture itself gives us the benchmark for what real faith is supposed to look like. And it's not about a rigid checklist of rules. It asks, what's required? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. History shows us that as soon as that humility is lost, that's when institutions start to harden. That's when persuasion turns into force. And it's not always about obvious brute force, right? Political thinkers like the brilliant Hannah Arendt documented how modern systems got really sophisticated with this. They control the official story. Suddenly, the truth isn't as important as what's useful for the system. They redefine words to shape how you think, and they create these massive bureaucracies where moral responsibility gets so spread out that nobody feels accountable for anything.
So, if big institutions are so prone to this kind of decay, where does that leave us? What's the role of the individual in all of this? Well, that brings us to our personal responsibility to have discernment.
I love this. The book of Proverbs gives some incredibly practical, down-to-earth advice. It basically says a naive person believes everything they hear, but a wise person thinks carefully about where they're going. It puts the responsibility right back on our shoulders to not just blindly accept every word we're told.
And let's be absolutely clear. This isn't about being paranoid or cynical about everything. It's a timeless, universal call to use our brains, to think critically. It doesn't matter if you're religious or secular, that mandate to question, to analyze, and to discern is exactly the same. All right, we're in the home stretch. Truth and freedom. We've looked at the problem, we've seen the pattern. So what's the timeless answer to this decay of unchecked power? It all comes down to the deep connection between truth and freedom.
So let's just recap the core warnings we've seen pop up again and again in both scripture and history. First, power without accountability will always decay. Second, institutions have a tendency to outlive their original good intentions and just become self-serving. And third, and this one is sneaky, the very language of morality can be twisted and used as a weapon to control people.
But the takeaway here isn't to be paranoid or divided. The response is actually a clear three-part plan. First, discernment. Have the courage to think for yourself. Second, historical awareness. Learn to recognize these patterns when they show up. And finally, and maybe the hardest one, moral humility. Have the wisdom to question your own certainties.
And in the end, it really all comes back to this one powerful idea, that the pursuit of truth, no matter how hard or uncomfortable it is the ultimate antidote to control and corruption. It's not just some abstract idea. It's presented as the very path to real, genuine freedom. So the question for all of us is, what does that pursuit of truth look like in our lives today?